There's a specific kind of madness that lives on the American highway after 3 a.m. When you are driving a multi-ton machine through the pitch-black void of the Mojave Desert, or navigating the treacherous, ice-slicked mountain passes of Wyoming in the dead of winter, your mind begins to play tricks on you. The white lines blur. The shadows cast by your headlights seem to stretch, twist, and reach out for the hood of your car. They call it highway hypnosis. The rational part of your brain tells you that you were just tired. It tells you that the figure you saw standing on the shoulder of the road was just a mile marker. It tells you that the strange voice bleeding through the static on your CB radio is just a crossed frequency. But what happens when the rationalizations fail? What happens when you pull over to check your tires in the middle of nowhere and you realize that the shadow standing by the tree line is actively walking toward you? Welcome back to Prince of Darkness. Before we shift into gear and drive into the black, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now to appease the algorithm and help this channel grow. And if you are brave enough to ride shotgun through the darkest corners of the world, subscribe and turn on all notifications. Tonight, we are exploring 4 deeply disturbing, heavily documented, and terrifying true accounts from long-haul truckers and night shift drivers who experienced the absolute worst the open road has to offer. From highly classified sealed cargo that refuses to stay quiet, to abandoned rest stops that do not exist on any map, and the deeply unsettling things that pace your vehicle in the dead of night. Check your rearview mirror, lock your doors, and whatever you do, do not pull over. Our first account comes from a retired, fiercely independent long-haul trucker named Arthur. By 1998, Arthur had been driving his custom Peterbilt 379 for over 20 years. He was a veteran of the asphalt. He thought he knew every scam, every danger, and every type of freight the interstate had to offer. But a highly classified, off-the-books contract run from the Nevada desert to an undisclosed underground facility in New Mexico proved him terrifyingly wrong. As an independent owner-operator with a clean record and a heavy-duty rig, you sometimes get approached for specialized loads. These aren't posted on public load boards. They're offered through quiet phone calls, and they pay triple, sometimes quadruple the standard rate per mile. The only catch is the paperwork, or rather, the complete lack of it, and the incredibly strict, non-negotiable rules of the haul. I was contracted to pick up a single, heavily reinforced 53-foot refrigerated trailer. In the industry, we call them reefers. The pickup location wasn't a standard logistics hub. It was a private, heavily guarded, unpaved airstrip located 60 miles off the main highway, deep in the desolate Nevada desert. I was instructed to arrive at exactly 1 a.m. When I pulled my cab through the chain-link gates, the atmosphere was immediately suffocating. The desert air was freezing, but the men standing around the lone trailer were sweating. There were at least 6 armed contractors in unmarked tactical gear, carrying automatic rifles, actively patrolling a perimeter around the trailer. A man in a sharp, dark suit who looked entirely out of place in the dirt and dust walked up to my window. He didn't introduce himself. He just handed me a thick manila envelope stuffed with $100 bills and a clipboard holding a single sheet of paper. The reefer cooling unit is permanently set to a constant -20 degrees Celsius, the man said. His voice was completely flat, devoid of any human emotion. You are to drive straight through to the destination coordinates provided. You do not stop for state way stations. Your plates have been cleared. You do not stop for gas. Your auxiliary tanks have been topped off. And under no circumstances do you break the heavy-duty biometric padlock on those rear trailer doors. Not for police, not for border patrol, and not for your own curiosity. He leaned in slightly closer, his eyes locking onto mine. If you hear a mechanical failure in the cooling unit, you stop the truck, leave the keys in the ignition, and you run into the desert. Do not look back. Do you understand me, Arthur? I swallowed hard, nodded, signed the single line on the paper, and climbed back into my cab. I backed up to the trailer, aligning my fifth wheel. When the kingpin locked into place with a heavy metallic thud, my truck physically shuddered. I hooked up my pneumatic air lines, performed a rushed pre-trip inspection under the watchful eyes of the armed guards, and pulled out onto the pitch-black two-lane desert highway. For the first 4 hours, the drive down the desolate stretches of US Route 93 was surprisingly smooth. The heavy 600-horsepower diesel engine under my hood hummed perfectly, and the steady, vibrating mechanical drone of the reefer cooling unit mounted right behind my sleeper cab was a comforting, rhythmic white noise. I drank my coffee. I listened to the static on the CB radio. I told myself it was probably just highly experimental chemicals or some classified aerospace components. But around 4:30 a.m., as I was passing through an entirely dead, unpopulated stretch of highway with no cell service, no radio stations, and no moonlight, the environment inside my cab began to aggressively change. It started with the temperature. Despite the truck's heavy-duty heater blasting hot air directly at my feet, the ambient air in the truck plummeted. It felt like walking into a meat locker. I could see my own breath pluming in the dark cab. The windshield began to rapidly frost over from the inside, forcing me to use my ice scraper while driving. Then, the truck physically shifted. I was doing 65 miles an hour on a perfectly straight, flat, recently paved piece of asphalt when the entire 70-foot, 80,000-pound rig violently swayed to the right. It felt as if the trailer had just absorbed the broadside impact of a massive, hurricane-force gust of wind. But the desert outside was dead calm. The sagebrush wasn't even twitching. I gripped the massive steering wheel with both hands, white-knuckling it, aggressively correcting the drift to keep the rig out of the dirt shoulder. I checked my side mirrors, my eyes darting frantically. Nothing, just the red glow of my taillights and absolute darkness. Then, over the deafening roar of the diesel engine and the continuous hum of the cooling unit, I heard it. Thud. A massive, incredibly heavy impact struck against the interior front wall of the trailer, directly behind my sleeper berth. It was so forceful, so violently concentrated, that I physically felt the shock wave travel through the steel frame of the truck, up through the floorboards and directly into my driver's seat. My heart instantly hammered against my ribs, pumping pure adrenaline into my system. Cargo shifts all the time. If a wooden pallet breaks or if heavy nylon straps come loose, thousands of pounds of freight can slide and hit the walls. But this didn't feel like a pallet sliding. A pallet hits once and then it settles. 10 seconds of agonizing silence passed, and then thud, thud, thud. 3 distinct, rhythmic, calculated strikes against the thick, insulated metal wall. It wasn't shifting cargo. Something inside that locked, freezing, pitch-black trailer was actively, aggressively, and intentionally hitting the wall. I grabbed my CB radio microphone with a shaking hand, intending to call out on Channel 19 for any other drivers in the area. But when I keyed the mic, all I got was thick, heavy, unbroken, aggressive static. It sounded like the signal was being actively jammed. Thud, thud, crack. The strikes were getting harder, faster. The thick, reinforced metal wall directly behind my head began to emit a terrifying metallic groaning noise. It was visibly denting inward toward my sleeper cab. Whatever was in that trailer possessed impossible, terrifying physical strength, and it was methodically trying to break out of the box and into the cab with me. The man in the suit's warning suddenly echoed in my head, loud and clear. If you hear a mechanical failure, you leave the truck and you run. Suddenly, the continuous, comforting hum of the reefer cooling unit violently sputtered. It choked, let out a loud mechanical grinding noise, and completely, permanently died. Total, suffocating silence fell over the highway, broken only by the rhythmic slapping of my tires on the asphalt. Without the cooling unit actively pumping freezing air, the inside temperature inside the insulated trailer would immediately begin to rise. The thudding against the front wall stopped. I held my breath, staring at the road ahead, praying that whatever it was had knocked itself unconscious or frozen to death. But the silence was replaced by something infinitely worse. Through the thick metal, I heard a sound that froze the blood in my veins and sent a wave of primal evolutionary terror through my entire nervous system. It was a high-pitched, screeching wail. It didn't sound human. It didn't sound like any wild animal I had ever encountered in my decades on the road. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated, conscious rage. And it was immediately accompanied by the horrific, ear-piercing noise of heavy, dense claws scraping frantically against the reinforced steel walls of the trailer. Skirk, skirk, skirk. It was pacing inside the trailer, tearing at the insulation, looking for a weak point. I didn't stop the truck. I didn't run into the desert. I slammed my heavy steel-toed boot down on the accelerator, pinning it to the floor. I pushed the massive rig to 85 miles an hour, ignoring the speed governors, praying to God that the tires wouldn't blow out under the stress. I drove for another 2 hours of absolute, unfiltered psychological torture. I was trapped in a tiny metal box, listening to that thing physically tear apart the inside of the trailer, screaming and thrashing in the dark, just inches behind my head. As the sun finally began to rise, casting a pale, bleeding orange light over the New Mexico border, the violent screeching slowly began to weaken. It turned into a wet, heavy, gurgling wheeze, and then, as I pulled off the designated exit, it went dead silent. I pulled into the heavily guarded razor wire fenced destination facility at exactly 8 a.m. I was shaking so violently I could barely put the truck into neutral. I was completely drenched in cold, foul-smelling sweat. Tactical teams immediately swarmed the truck. They didn't ask me how the drive was. They didn't offer me a cup of coffee. They didn't even ask me for the paperwork. They aggressively unhooked the trailer from my cab, handed me a second, much thicker envelope of cash through the window, and told me to leave the facility immediately, destroy my logbooks, and never, ever mention the route or the cargo. As I pulled my bobtail cab away from the loading dock, I couldn't help it. I looked in my large convex rearview mirror. A specialized team of men, dressed in full, heavy-duty, pressurized hazardous material suits, were approaching the rear of the trailer carrying heavy plasma cutting torches. I saw the back of the trailer clearly. The heavy steel doors were bulging violently outward, completely deformed from the inside out, and they were covered in deep, jagged, outward-facing puncture marks that had nearly pierced all the way through the inch-thick reinforced steel. I retired from long-haul trucking the very next week. I sold my Peterbilt. I don't know what they dug up in the Nevada desert, and I don't know what they were trying to transport to that underground lab. But I know that for a few terrifying hours, the only thing separating me from a highly classified apex nightmare was a few inches of steel and a padlock. And whatever it was, it absolutely refused to be frozen. If the visceral terror of our first story came from what was trapped inside the truck, this next heavily documented account explores the terrifying, isolating vulnerability of having to step outside the safety of the cab in the middle of absolute nowhere. This story takes place on US Route 50 in Nevada, a stretch of asphalt notoriously and officially known as the loneliest road in America. In the early 20-teens, I was working as a team driver for a major national logistics company, partnered with a veteran driver named Greg. The brutal rule of team driving is simple and unforgiving. One guy sleeps in the moving berth in the back while the other drives, keeping the wheels turning and the freight moving 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's an exhausting, physically draining lifestyle. It was my shift at the wheel. It was exactly 3:15 a.m. Route 50 is a terrifying, monotonous stretch of highway. It's perfectly straight, entirely flat, and cuts relentlessly through endless barren desert valleys and desolate mountain passes. You can drive for 3 straight hours without seeing a single pair of headlights, a gas station, a house, or a town. It's just you, the drone of the engine, and the hypnotic rhythm of the dashed white lines disappearing under your bumper. I had been holding my bladder for over 120 miles, chain-drinking black, bitter truck stop coffee just to keep my eyes open. My GPS unit, mounted on the dash, indicated there were absolutely no commercial services for another 2.5 hours. But up ahead, in the pitch-black distance, my high beams caught the faint reflection of a faded, weather-beaten blue sign on the shoulder. Rest area, 1 mile. A massive wave of relief washed over me. I slowly let off the accelerator, engaging the heavy engine brake. The loud staccato brap, brap, brap of the Jake brake rattled aggressively through the silent, sleeping desert. I pulled off the highway onto an unpaved, heavily rutted gravel off-ramp. This rest area was not a modern, well-lit, state-funded facility with vending machines and security cameras. It was completely primitive, just a large, desolate, circular gravel lot surrounded on all sides by thick, dark sagebrush and looming, invisible mountains. In the dead center of the lot sat a small, brutalist, windowless concrete block building, the restrooms. A single flickering, sickly yellow sodium vapor light buzzed angrily above the entrance, attracting a massive swarm of desert moths. There were no other semi-trucks parked, no passenger cars, no RVs, just my massive rig idling loudly in the empty void. I left the engine running to keep the cab's heater on for Greg, who was dead asleep, snoring loudly behind the privacy curtain in the sleeper berth. I grabbed my heavy Maglite flashlight, hopped down the 3 metal steps out of the cab, and instantly felt the freezing, biting, dry desert wind hit my face. The silence out there, even with my truck idling 50 feet away, was heavy. It felt oppressive. It felt like the desert was holding its breath. I walked across the crunching gravel toward the concrete building. The yellow light above the door flickered violently, casting long, strange, unnatural shadows across the dirt. I pushed the heavy, rusted metal door to the men's room open. It creaked incredibly loudly, the hinges screaming in protest. The smell that hit me was nauseating, a concentrated mix of harsh industrial ammonia, stale urine, and stagnant, rotting water. The exposed fluorescent light tubes inside were humming loudly, casting a harsh, pale, flickering glare over the filthy, cracked tile floor. I stepped up to the rusted steel urinal. The bathroom was completely empty and completely silent, except for the buzzing lights and the sound of my own heavy breathing. But as I stood there, facing the wall, the heavy metal entry door behind me slowly swung open. It didn't bang open. It swung inward with a long, drawn-out, agonizingly slow screech of metal on metal. I completely froze. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't heard a car pull into the lot. My truck was the only thing making noise. I hadn't heard the distinct, loud crunching of boots on the gravel outside. I didn't turn around immediately. I held my breath and listened. There were no footsteps entering the bathroom, no coughing, no sound of clothing rustling, just the sound of the heavy metal door slowly, automatically closing on its pneumatic hinge until the latch clicked shut. I quickly finished, zipped up my pants, and slowly, cautiously turned around to head to the filthy sinks. Standing in the far corner of the bathroom, partially obscured by the dark shadow of a broken hanging stall door, was a man. He was facing the corner. His nose was pressed completely, uncomfortably flat against the grimy cinder block wall. He was wearing dirty, oversized, dark blue mechanics coveralls that hung loosely off an incredibly gaunt skeletal frame. His arms hung limply at his sides. "Hey man, everything all right?" I asked. My voice sounded weak, echoing slightly off the damp tiles. He didn't respond. He didn't flinch. He didn't turn around. He didn't even shift his weight from one foot to the other. He stood as rigid, stiff, and perfectly still as a discarded department store mannequin. But then, as I stared at his back, bathed in the flickering fluorescent light, I noticed a detail that made my stomach violently drop into my shoes. He wasn't breathing. The heavy fabric of his coveralls wasn't rising and falling. His shoulders were completely, unnaturally frozen. Even a person standing perfectly still shifts slightly. This man was entirely devoid of micro-movements. I didn't wait around to find out what was wrong with him. I slowly backed away toward the heavy metal exit door, keeping my eyes locked dead on his back, my hand reaching blindly behind me for the cold metal push bar. As my fingers grazed the cold metal of the door, the man in the corner finally moved. He didn't turn his body around. His torso and his feet remained perfectly still, facing the corner of the room. But his head slowly, mechanically snapped backward. It pivoted on his neck with a sickening, loud, wet crack of breaking cartilage, turning a full 180 degrees until he was staring directly over his own shoulder, right at me. His face was a nightmare. It was horribly, fundamentally wrong. His skin was a pale, waxy, translucent gray. His eyes were wide open, entirely unblinking, and they were completely black, solid, glossy voids lacking any whites or irises. His jaw hung slack, unnaturally low, as if the muscles had completely deteriorated, exposing a dark, gaping void of a mouth. Then, a low, vibrating mechanical hum began to slowly emanate from his open, motionless mouth. It didn't sound human. It sounded like television static mixed with the angry buzzing of the fluorescent lights above us. I didn't hesitate. I threw my entire body weight against the heavy metal exit door, bursting out of the bathroom and stumbling into the freezing desert air. I sprinted across the gravel lot toward my idling truck, my boots kicking up rocks. But as I reached the passenger side of my cab, intending to yank the door open, I stopped dead in my tracks. I stopped breathing. Surrounding my 18-wheeler, standing perfectly still in the loose gravel, were at least 10 more figures. They were men, women, and teenagers. They were all wearing dirty, faded, outdated clothes from different eras. A woman in a 1970s floral dress, a man in a faded 1990s windbreaker. And every single one of them was facing away from the truck. They were standing in a perfect circle around the rig, staring blankly out into the dark, empty sagebrush, as still as statues. I didn't scream. I knew if I made a sound, they would all turn their heads. I quietly, frantically climbed up the 3 metal steps, yanked the heavy cab door open, threw myself inside into the driver's seat, and slammed the locks down with the palm of my hand. I threw the massive transmission into gear, didn't even bother releasing the parking brake properly, and slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The massive diesel engine roared in protest, kicking up a massive, blinding cloud of dust and gravel as I tore out of the lot. I completely blew through the stop sign at the end of the ramp, nearly rolling the trailer as I merged blindly and violently onto the empty highway. Greg woke up from the violent, chaotic movement. He tore the privacy curtain back, sticking his head out of the sleeper berth, rubbing his eyes. "What the hell are you doing? Are you trying to kill us?" he yelled over the roar of the engine. "Don't look back!" I screamed at him, my hands trembling so violently I could barely keep the steering wheel straight. "Get back in the bunk and just don't look out the damn mirrors." I drove at 85 miles an hour, my foot pinned to the floor for 2 straight hours until we hit the glowing lights of the town of Ely. When we finally stopped at a brightly lit, heavily populated truck stop, I explained the entire nightmare to Greg. He thought I was losing my mind. He thought I was hallucinating from lack of sleep. We pulled the SD card from the dash cam to prove I wasn't crazy. We sat in the cab, watching the footage on my laptop. The dash cam had recorded my approach to the rest area. It recorded the flickering yellow light. It recorded me getting out and walking to the bathroom. And it recorded me sprinting back, throwing the truck into gear and speeding away. But the gravel lot on the video was completely empty. There were no figures surrounding the truck. The camera didn't pick up the woman in the dress or the man in the windbreaker. It just picked up the empty gravel and the dust I kicked up as I fled. A month later, out of morbid, obsessive curiosity, I looked up the exact mile marker on a detailed, official Department of Transportation grid map of Nevada. There is no official rest area listed at that mile marker. The DOT has no record of a concrete building or a gravel pull-off at those coordinates. I still drive for a living. I have a family to feed. But I never, ever take Route 50. Because I know that crumbling concrete building is out there in the dark. And I know those things are still standing in the gravel, facing the desert, waiting for the next tired, desperate driver to pull over. Isolation on the American highway is not always geographical. Sometimes it is entirely meteorological. Nature can create a cage far more effective than any desert. Our third account comes from a heavy-haul flatbed trucker named Marcus, who found himself caught in the lethal, suffocating grip of a sudden, blinding whiteout blizzard in the remote, treacherous mountains of Wyoming. If you have never driven an 80,000-pound rig through a Wyoming blizzard at 2 in the morning, you cannot possibly understand the sheer, overwhelming terror of it. It's called a whiteout for a very literal reason. Your high beams hit the solid wall of falling snow and reflect the blinding white light directly back into your retinas. Visibility drops to absolute zero. You are completely, terrifyingly blind, relying entirely on the physical vibration of the rumble strips under your tires to know you haven't drifted off the edge of a mountain pass. I was hauling a heavy load of industrial steel pipes eastbound on Interstate 80, trying desperately to outrun a massive, unpredictable winter storm system moving out of the Pacific Northwest. I lost the race. By 1 a.m., the storm hit the mountain pass with biblical, violent fury. The highway was instantly buried in 6 inches of unplowed, slick snow. The crosswinds were howling at 50 miles an hour, physically rocking my massive cab back and forth on its suspension. I dropped my speed to a crawling 15 miles an hour, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned bone white, leaning forward, desperately looking for a safe exit ramp or a wide shoulder to pull over and wait it out. My CB radio, which is usually a chaotic, noisy lifeline in these situations filled with other truckers sharing road conditions and warnings, was completely dead. Just heavy, unbroken, white noise static. The density of the storm was completely blocking the radio waves. I was entirely alone in a white, frozen, moving void. Then, the static on the CB radio suddenly cut out with a sharp electronic click. A voice broke through the silence of the cab. "Breaker 19, any eastbound ears on? I got a major 1042 situation here. Anybody copy? Please." It was a man's voice. He sounded panicked, completely out of breath, his voice cracking with fear. 1042 is an older police 10 code for a severe accident or a catastrophic breakdown. I immediately grabbed my mic, overwhelmingly relieved to hear another living human being in the storm. "Yeah, I copy you loud and clear, driver. I'm eastbound near mile marker 210. It's a complete whiteout out here. What's your 20? The radio crackled violently. "I'm a westbound four-wheeler. My engine died. The heater's gone. I got my wife and 2 young kids in the car. We're freezing to death out here. We're at mile marker 212, pulled off on the right shoulder. Please, man, you gotta help us. My kids are turning blue." Mile marker 212. He was exactly 2 miles ahead of me. If a family was trapped in a dead car with no heat in a Wyoming blizzard, the ambient temperature and wind chill would kill them in less than an hour. "I'm on my way," I said firmly into the mic. "Keep your hazard lights flashing so I can see you. I'll pull over on the eastbound shoulder, walk across the median, and get you all into the sleeper cab. I got heat." "Thank you," the voice replied, sounding like he was weeping. "Hurry, please." I leaned forward, my face mere inches from the frosted windshield, straining my eyes until they watered, peering through the blinding, hypnotic wall of snow. I watched the digital odometer slowly tick by. 1 mile, a mile and a half. As I approached the estimated location of mile marker 212, I slowed the rig down to a 5-mile-an-hour crawl, looking desperately for the amber, rhythmic flash of hazard lights on the opposite side of the divided highway. Through the dense, swirling, chaotic snow, I saw a faint, dim, dark shape sitting on the right shoulder of the westbound lane. It was a vehicle, heavily buried under a snowdrift. There were no lights flashing, but batteries die fast in the freezing cold. "I see you," I said into the radio. "I'm pulling over on my side right now. I'm walking across the median. Stay in the car and keep the doors closed until I knock." I threw the massive truck into park, leaving the engine roaring to keep the heat blasting. I grabbed my heavy, insulated winter coat, a high-powered tactical flashlight, and a metal thermos of boiling hot coffee. I pushed my door open and stepped out into the brutal, freezing wind. The cold hit my lungs like inhaling shattered glass. I trudged heavily through the knee-deep freezing snow of the wide median, shielding my face from the biting wind with my arm, shining my light toward the stranded car. But as I got within 20 feet of the vehicle, the beam of my flashlight revealed a detail that made my blood run instantly, paralyzingly cold. It wasn't a modern family sedan. It was a burnt-out, rusted, decaying skeletal husk of a 1970s station wagon. It had no tires, sitting on rusted metal rims. The windows had been completely shattered out years ago, and the interior of the car was packed solid from floor to ceiling with compacted snow, dirt, and ice. This car hadn't broken down tonight. This vehicle had been abandoned, stripped, and rusting on this shoulder for decades. There was no family inside, and there were absolutely no fresh tire tracks in the snow leading up to it. I stopped dead in the middle of the median, the wind howling violently around me, my flashlight beam shaking erratically on the rusted metal. Suddenly, my portable handheld CB radio, clipped to the breast pocket of my heavy coat, hissed to life. It was the exact same voice, the same man, but he wasn't panicked anymore. He wasn't crying. His voice was completely calm, flat, devoid of any emotion, and it sounded like it was speaking directly, intimately into my ear. "I see you, Marcus. You left your door unlocked." My heart stopped beating. The blood drained from my face. How did he know my name? I never gave my name on the radio. I whipped around in the deep snow, shining my high-powered flashlight back across the median toward my massive, idling 18-wheeler. standing in the blinding snow, directly next to the open driver's side door of my cab, illuminated by the amber running lights of my truck, was a towering, massive silhouette. It was at least 7 feet tall, unnaturally thin, wearing a tattered, heavy dark coat that flapped violently in the wind. It wasn't trying to climb into the truck. It wasn't stealing my gear. It was standing perfectly still by the open door, staring directly at me through the blizzard, holding my truck's wired CB radio microphone in its long, elongated, pale hand. I didn't yell. I didn't try to run back to the truck to fight it. The sheer, overwhelming primal terror of what I was looking at bypassed all logical thought. I dropped the thermos of coffee into the snow, turned my back to the highway, and sprinted blindly down the snowy median, away from my truck, running completely blind into the whiteout storm. I ran until my legs gave out, until I collapsed from pure exhaustion and hypothermia, tumbling down a steep rocky embankment and burying myself deep in a snowdrift to hide, praying the snow would cover my scent. I was found 8 hours later by a state DOT snowplow operator. I was severely frostbitten, entirely unresponsive, and half dead. When the state police recovered my truck later that afternoon, it was exactly where I had left it. The engine was still idling perfectly. The heat was still blasting inside the cab. But the heavy, reinforced driver's side door was ripped completely cleanly off its heavy steel hinges and thrown 20 feet away into the snow. The police report officially assumed that a violent, sudden gust of mountain wind had caught the open door and snapped the hinges. But I know what unhooked the latch. I never drove a commercial truck again. I surrendered my CDL. Because whatever is hunting in those treacherous mountains doesn't just use teeth or claws. It uses our own human empathy against us. It uses our radios. It baits the trap perfectly. And I know, with absolute certainty, that it is waiting out there, in the blinding whiteout storm, for the next driver who stops to help. Our final account explores a deeply unsettling psychological phenomenon known only to veterans of the late-night drive. Sometimes, the horror of the highway isn't a feral monster, a ghost, or a blizzard. Sometimes, the sheer, mind-breaking terror comes from the inexplicable, highly disturbing, and impossible behavior of another human being sharing the road with you. I drive a dedicated, repetitive route from Phoenix, Arizona to Los Angeles, California. The schedule requires me to drive through the heart of the Mojave Desert in the dead, quiet hours of the night. It's a route I've done hundreds of times over the last 10 years. You get intimately used to the darkness, the isolation, and the terrifying tricks your brain plays on you when you stare at a white line for 6 hours straight. But what happened to me on a Tuesday night in late August wasn't a trick of the mind. It wasn't highway hypnosis. It was exactly 2:30 a.m. I was driving westbound on an entirely desolate, straight stretch of Interstate 10, doing exactly 70 miles an hour, my foot resting while the cruise control did the work. I hadn't seen another set of headlights or glowing red taillights for over an hour and a half. Then, I noticed a faint, dim glow in my left side convex mirror. A vehicle was slowly creeping up on me in the left passing lane. It wasn't speeding aggressively. It was moving at maybe 71 miles an hour, agonizingly, painstakingly slow in its approach. I didn't think much of it. It happens all the time. I kept my eyes focused on the dark road ahead, waiting for the car to finally pass me and disappear into the night. The sedan slowly pulled up alongside the massive cab of my truck. It was a mid-2000s, dark-colored, generic four-door sedan. unremarkable in every way. But it didn't pass me. The very second its front bumper was perfectly parallel to the flat nose of my truck, the driver hit the brakes and matched my speed exactly. 70 miles an hour, perfectly parallel, locked onto my side. A cold prickle of genuine unease ran down my spine. I aggressively pushed the accelerator, speeding up to 75 miles an hour. The sedan smoothly, silently accelerated, staying locked onto my side like a guided military missile. This terrifying dance went on for 20 agonized minutes. No matter what speed I chose, 50, 80, 65, the dark sedan matched it flawlessly, maintaining an exact, unchanging 5-foot distance from my massive, spinning tires. The unease curdled into active, sweating panic. Were they trying to hijack me? Was this an elaborate cartel trap? Was there a weapon pointed at my door? I decided I needed to get a look at the driver. I grabbed my high-powered, million-candle-power heavy tactical flashlight that I keep for nighttime trailer inspections. I rolled down my automatic window, the loud rush of wind filling the cab, and shined the blinding, concentrated white beam directly down into the driver's seat of the pacing sedan. What the blinding light revealed in that car completely, fundamentally shattered my mind. There was a man sitting behind the wheel. He was wearing a filthy, tattered, pale green hospital gown. But he wasn't looking at the road. His head was tilted completely backward, resting heavily against the headrest, his neck stretched backward at a sickening, painful, anatomically impossible angle. He was staring straight up at the fabric ceiling of his car. His eyes were pinned wide open, completely unblinking, rolling back so far into his skull that I could only see the wet, bulging whites. His jaw was unhinged, his mouth stretched open into a massive, unnatural, gaping O shape, like a silent, frozen scream. He was driving a 2-ton vehicle at 75 miles an hour in the pitch-black desert while staring straight up at the ceiling in a state of absolute catatonic paralysis. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were bone white, but his arms were completely stiff. I was paralyzed with sheer, unadulterated terror. The physics made no sense. How was he keeping the car perfectly straight? How was he reacting to my erratic speed changes with microsecond precision without looking at the road? Suddenly, while still staring blindly up at the ceiling, the man's gaping jaw snapped shut with a violent, audible clack. He slowly, mechanically lowered his head, turning his neck toward me with a series of jerky, robotic, ratcheting movements until he was staring directly up through my window, right into my eyes. His face was completely devoid of humanity. It wasn't the face of a living person. It was the face of a corpse being violently puppeteered by something unseen. He raised his right hand off the steering wheel, slowly pointed a single, trembling, pale finger directly at my face, and began to violently, hysterically laugh. I couldn't hear the sound over the deafening roar of the engines and the wind, but I could see his chest heaving, his mouth tearing open in a silent, maniacal, terrifying laugh. I completely lost my mind. The primal urge to survive took over. I slammed my fist onto my massive air horn, unleashing a deafening blast that echoed across the empty desert, and I swerved my 80,000-pound truck violently into the left lane. I intended to run his car off the road, to crush his vehicle into the dirt median to save my own life. I braced myself for the violent, grinding crunch of steel on steel. I braced for the impact, but it never came. My massive truck drifted smoothly into the left lane, hitting nothing but empty air. I slammed both feet on the brakes, bringing the massive, shuddering rig to a halt on the gravel shoulder. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking so hard I dropped it twice and shined the beam wildly in every direction. The highway was completely, totally empty. The dark sedan was gone. There were no red taillights disappearing in the distance ahead of me. There were no black skid marks on the asphalt, no dust clouds in the median to suggest a crash, just the vast, silent, terrifying, unending emptiness of the Mojave Desert. I locked my doors, climbed into the sleeper berth, and sat in the corner clutching a heavy tire iron to my chest, shaking uncontrollably until the sun finally came up. I still drive that route today. I have to. It pays the bills and puts food on the table. But I paid to have illegal blackout tint installed on my side windows, and I never, ever look down at the cars passing me in the dark. Because I know that if I look down into the dark, he might still be looking back. The highway at night is a terrifying paradox. It is the ultimate tool that connects civilization together, yet it is the ultimate embodiment of pure, inescapable isolation. When you are behind the wheel, staring into the dark, past the limited reach of your headlights, you are entirely at the mercy of whatever waits in the black. The drivers in these 4 stories survive their routes, but the heavy psychological toll of what they witnessed in the dark will ride shotgun in their minds for the rest of their lives. The next time you are driving late at night and you see an unlit rest stop glowing dimly in the distance, or you hear a strange, panicked voice crackle through the radio static, or a dark, silent car pulls up beside you and lingers just a little too long, remember these warnings. Keep your eyes locked on the road ahead. Do not pull over, and pray that you make it to the morning light. If you have your own terrifying, unexplained encounter from the open road, leave it in the comments below. I read every single one, and your story might be featured in our next descent into the dark. If this documentary made you rethink your next midnight drive, please hit that like button and subscribe to Prince of Darkness with notifications turned on. Until next time, stay in the passing lane, double-check your locks, and stay out of the dark. Good night.